Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my best books of 2021. I can't believe that we are here again, that it is the end of another year and we are already wrapping up another year of reading. At the time of filming this, there are actually still a few days left in the year, but I know myself enough to know that I'm not going to finish anything else in the next few days, and what I do finish is likely not going to make it onto a favorites list. I know I'm not speaking only for myself when I say that 2021 was a very, very hard year for me. I know this was the case for a lot of people, and I know it really affected my reading in both good and bad ways because I was looking at my Goodreads while I was making my top 10 list for the year. Looking at my Goodreads, this is the year that I have actually read the most in the time that I have been using Goodreads. Now, the years prior to Goodreads are a very, very murky period. I have no idea how much I read in those years, and in a lot of cases, I actually don't even know what I read in those years because I never tracked anything prior to Goodreads, and even once I got on Goodreads, it was a couple of years before I started utilizing kind of the currently reading section of the page, and I have really liked that. It's really great to me to be able to look back on Goodreads and see how many books in a year I read. And this year is the year that I have read the most since I have been utilizing Goodreads. And I think it's just really interesting. That is not something that I expected. At the current time of filming this, I have read 115 books. Now, a lot of these were shorter books this year, and a lot of them were also audiobooks. I really got into audiobook listening towards the beginning of the year, and I definitely do not think that 2022 will hold this much reading for me. But it is interesting to note that I have read that much when the past couple of months have not really been big reading months for me at all. But while the quantity of what I have read has certainly been more than in previous years, it was actually very hard for me to construct a top 10 list, a top 5 list. I was really struggling. There were a lot of books that I rated 5 stars this year, but many of them were rereads, and I didn't necessarily feel as though it was appropriate to put them on a yearly favorites when this year was not the first time I read them. And frankly, a lot of the 5-star reads that I had have been actually very forgettable. And some of the books that I'm going to talk about today, I really didn't remember much about until I saw them on my stats page on Goodreads, and I remembered, oh yeah, that was a really great book. And so while I may have read more this year than what I typically do, I don't think I read as much that stuck with me. I don't think I read as much that was truly memorable to me, which is unfortunate. I remember last year as being a bit of a banger. There were a lot of really heavy hitters on my favorites list last year, and I was knocking things off that I wanted to include. This year, though I've read more, there were far less favorites that I wanted to put on the list this year. But let's get right into it. I might actually have 11 and not 10, it seems like. And I'm gonna go in no particular order. I don't even have really a top book of the year. And hopefully through doing this video, I will figure out what my favorite book of the year was. But right now, I truly don't know. This is just a group of books that I really enjoyed this year. And some of them have been moved into kind of the upper echelons of favorites of all time. So I will tell you about those when we get there. The first book I want to talk about is not a book that I actually gave 5 stars, but I do think it really set the tone for me in the rest of the reading year and really influenced some of what I picked up in the rest of the year. And that is The Confessions of Young Nero by Margaret George. I listened to this on audiobook back in February, it seems like. I just was completely taken by storm with this. I truly don't think I would have enjoyed it as much had I read it physically, but because I read it via audiobook, I just really connected with the time period, with the characters, and I think the narrators did a really, really fantastic job here. But this is a historical fiction book about the Roman Emperor Nero, who is pretty infamous in history for being a fairly unstable and fairly cruel emperor. This is actually a duology, and I read both books in the duology this year, and I will say the duology does quite a bit to make you feel sorry for Nero. And it is a really interesting historical fiction because it plays with your expectations of who these historical figures are and what they've done, rumors about them that we have always taken for fact. I thought this was very smartly written, and it also made me really enjoy Nero. Nero has become now one of my favorite Roman emperors. I really, really enjoyed learning more about him through this book and then wanting to pick up nonfiction about him and his time period, which has been really a great part of my reading year, I would say. I have just really enjoyed learning more about Nero. This really sent me down the rabbit hole. And so this one is one I didn't rate 5 stars, but it has loomed pretty large in my reading life. Another book that I did not initially rate 5 stars, but I have since gone back and lifted that rating, is A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. This is such a strange one for me because I also listened to this on audiobook and I listened to it back in January. I was really charmed by it, but I didn't really think anything of it, and I thought this is going to be a fairly forgettable read. So at the time I rated it 3 stars because I thought it was good, but I didn't necessarily think it was great. But this book is one I think about all the time. This is the only book I was sure I wanted to put on this list this year. This and another one, which we'll get to. But this was the only book I knew for sure had to go on a top books of the year list. And so this one is just really shocking to me because my initial feelings on it were very lukewarm. I wasn't really excited by it. I enjoyed it, but I wasn't really obsessed with it like I was some of the other books on this list. But while some of the other books on this list have kind of faded for me as time has gone on, this one has stayed very, very fresh, and I find myself thinking of the writing, I find myself thinking of the characters in ways that I never expected, because this book is not really one that seems to deal with really heavy issues, really heavy topics. It doesn't really seem as though it is trying to say much. It doesn't have a plot that you're trying to figure out. It's just kind of a really lighthearted love story a little bit, though there are definitely deeper elements at play, but it is basically at its heart a love story. And I am not a romance reader. So it's just very shocking to me that this book really took me by storm and really imprinted itself on me in such a way, because I have continued to think about it. I mean, once a month, sometimes once a week, I think about this book. And so definitely this one is one of my favorites of the year, and it might actually, in truth, be my favorite of the year if I am thinking about how often I have thought about a book in the months since finishing it. I read it at the beginning of the year, and it is still very, very fresh in my mind. Another book that I read at the very start of the year, and was in fact actually the first book that I read in 2021, was The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichec. This is a mythology retelling. It's a retelling of Angrboda, who is a figure in Norse mythology. She is a wife of Loki's. And I think this book is just really, really beautiful. It was so great to start off the year with a 5-star read. And this was anticipated for me, but I had my apprehensions about it. Norse myth is so strange. I feel like I say this a lot, but Norse myth is just really, really weird. And I think sometimes retellings or books that try to play with Norse mythology try to tamp down how strange things are, how weird elements of the stories are. This book didn't. This book was like, this is Norse mythology, accept it or don't, but this is what it is. And I really appreciated that. She did take some liberties with things, but that's to be expected to me in a retelling. This was very reminiscent of Circe, and Circe was one of my favorite books of 2018 or whenever it came out. It was very, very reminiscent of Circe because it is also a character study of kind of an original witch in mythology, which is what Angrboda is in Norse mythology. She is very equivalent to Circe because she spends a lot of her time isolated and also kind of vilified by other characters in Norse myth. And this one was just so special because not only were you endeared to Angrboda, but she really fell in love with Loki at the same time that she did. Now, some of us already have a built-in love for Loki, but it was really interesting how the characterization of him was done. There is another character who was a close friend of hers that was just really wonderfully written, and their friendship was so special to see. I feel like it's very rare to see really strong friendships in books, and so I just really loved that as well. This is one of the best fantasy reads of the past 5 years to me, and it is certainly one of the best mythology retellings that I have read in a very long time. This year I read quite a few Greek mythology retellings, and while this is Norse mythology and not Greek mythology, I don't feel as though those retellings got to the heart of the myth the way that this one did, and yet also did something very, very new with it and really encouraged us to get to know a character that has always felt like a side character in other members of Norse mythology's stories. So I just really liked this, and I really appreciated what it was doing. Genevieve Gornichec is now an auto-buy author for me, so this was certainly a big favorite of the year. Next, we have another classic. This year was also kind of peppered with Russian classics for me in many ways. Russian classics came to define 2021 for me, and I read quite a few of them that I really enjoyed, but only 2 were on this list. One of them I feel like you know because I can't shut up about it lately, and that's First Love by Ivan Turgenev. This is technically a novella where a guy tells the story of his first love, which is really tragic. I loved this so much. Words cannot express how much I loved this. This is another one that I went into kind of blind, and I think that's possibly the best way to do it. If you want to read this, try to know nothing about it. I think there is something to just walking into this one. And this is a case where I think not only was the plot really interesting, not only were the characters really interesting, but to me, the writing was just stunningly beautiful. I also listened to this on audiobook, and it's interesting to me now to look at this stack and know that quite a few of the books that are on this list are ones that I listened to on audio, and audio tends to be my least favorite format to read a book in. But I really do feel like audio helped a lot of these picks here, because First Love in particular seemed to kind of lend itself to an audio format because the setup of the story is as if someone is telling you a story about themselves. And I think it just really, in the end, was helped by the fact that I listened to it on audiobook. But it really gave a lyrical quality to the writing that was just lovely. After reading First Love, I went through quite a few short stories of Ivan Turgenev's, and I have loved them all. And so I'm really, really excited to continue on with him, to read more from him. But I think in the end, First Love will continue to be my absolute favorite. A book that is somewhat of a shock to me that I'm going to put on this list is a book that I'm actually really shocked that I read at all, and that is In the Woods by Tana French. This is a thriller novel, and I don't tend to pick up thriller novels very often, but this is just spectacular. I know everyone harps on about Tana French, and I'm probably not going to be the person to persuade you to pick her up, but this really is as good as you've always heard that it is. This is so lyrically written, and there's something so interesting about the themes at play in this book. I just think this was really, really well done, and everything I love was in this book. So the setup for this is that our main character, Rob Ryan, is a detective on the Dublin Murder Squad, and as a child, he and several friends went missing. He was found, none of the friends were. Now, in the modern day, as a detective, someone has been killed in the area where they went missing. But it's so interesting how everything in what you would think is kind of a basic setup plot all ties together in terms of theme, in terms of how your past impacts your future, impacts your present. Where they find the dead body is actually on an archaeological dig, and so there's kind of this element of digging up the past and finding mysteries, and Rob really interrogates his own past and how it has formed him as a person. When is time to move on? It's also a very thrilling mystery because you're trying to figure it out. The characterization and the character dynamics are so strong. This is just such a wonderful book, and really there is no flaw in it. There's literally nothing I would tell you I would have done differently. There is a part that really gets me irritated, but I understand why she did it. So I just really think this is an instance of a perfect book. And maybe not a perfect book for everyone, but a perfect book for me personally. I could not believe how every single thing I love in books somehow got combined in here in really, really interesting ways. I just thought this was so fresh and exciting, and I'm really excited that I found Tana French this year and that I have decided to continue on with her work. Another of my favorites of the year that is potentially one of my favorites of all time, and I'll say I really think on an objective level, this book is not only one of my favorites of the year, one of my favorites of all time, I think this is truly one of the best books that has ever been written, and that is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. The craft in this book is insane. I think truly his mastery of language is just utterly incredible. There are turns of phrase in this book that will literally almost make you cry. I think we all assume that we know what Moby Dick is about because it has so viscerally entered pop culture, but it's not really true, and I think you will enjoy the book more if you go into it understanding that what we think the plot of Moby Dick is actually the subplot. The main point of this book is really just to discuss whales and the whaling industry as a whole. And I won't say that characterization or plot take a backseat to that, but I think that's ultimately what Herman Melville was trying to do. I have an entire dedicated review to Moby Dick explaining all of the reasons why I love it, why I think people should pick it up. But it is a book that I understand people really struggle with and that some people just will hate, and that's completely fine. But if you have been on the fence about Moby Dick, I want to read you a passage that I think will convince you to give it a try. This is going to be kind of long, so bear with me. Once more, say you are in the country, in some high land of lakes. Take almost any path you please, and 10 to 1 that carries you down in a dale and leaves you there by a pool in the stream. There is magic in it. Let the most absent-minded of men be plunged in his deepest reveries. Stand that man on his legs, set his feet a-going, and he will infallibly lead you to water, if water there be in all that region. Should you ever be athirst in the great American desert, try this experiment, if your caravan happen to be supplied with a metaphysical professor. Yes, as everyone knows, meditation and water are wedded forever. But here is an artist. He desires to paint you the dreamiest, shadiest, quietest, most enchanting bit of romantic landscape in all the valley of the Saco. What is the chief element he employs? There stand his trees, each with a hollow trunk, as if a hermit and a crucifix were within. And here sleeps his meadow, and there sleep his cattle, and up from yonder cottage goes a sleepy smoke. Deep into distant woodlands winds a mazy way, reaching to overlapping spurs of mountains bathed in their hillside blue. But though the picture lies thus tranced, and though this pine tree shakes down its sighs like leaves upon this shepherd's head, yet all were vain, unless the shepherd's eye were fixed upon the magic stream before him. Go visit the prairies in June, when for scores on scores of miles you wade knee-deep among tiger lilies. What is the one charm wanting? Water. There is not a drop of water there. Were Niagara but a cataract of sand, would you travel your 1,000 miles to see it? Why did the poor poet of Tennessee, upon suddenly receiving 2 handfuls of silver, deliberate whether to buy him a coat, which he sadly needed, or invest his money in a pedestrian trip to Rockaway Beach? Why is almost every robust, healthy boy with a robust, healthy soul in him, at some time or other, crazy to go to sea? Why upon your first voyage as a passenger did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deity, an own brother of Jove? Surely all this is not without meaning, and still deeper the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. So that's from essentially the opening pages of the book, and it is a meditation on why we are drawn to water, why people want to go to sea. That is an indication of what I think the themes of this book are, which is all about the sea, all about the allure of the ocean and the creatures in it. It's just a really beautiful, beautiful book. And I think if you are someone who really loves the ocean, loves the water, I think you will appreciate what this book is doing, because I think it will speak to the part of you that feels like you're coming home the minute that you smell the salt air. I read this when I was at the beach, and I have to wonder if that's part of why I really loved it, is because I was there, I was in my happy place, and I was reading a book that kind of discussed why we love that and why we are compelled to come back to that time and time again. And that is not the most beautiful passage of this book. The last line of this book is amazing. I just really am stunned by Moby Dick. Like I said, I think Moby Dick is not only maybe my favorite of the year, but I think it is also just genuinely one of the best books that I have ever read, and one of the best books that was ever written. I constantly wondered why people talked about this as the great American novel. Now I know why. This is truly a great one and is potentially my actual favorite book of the year. Another book that I knew for sure had to go on this list is Half Sick of Shadows by Laura Sebastian. This is an Arthurian legend retelling, and it is a standalone, which is a lot of its charm. It gets everything done in one book. It focuses on the Lady of Shalott rather than any of our more typical Arthurian heroes for this retelling, and I thought that was really innovative and new, and I really, really liked it. Certainly there are a lot of flaws in this book, and I even had qualms about giving it 5 stars myself, but then I thought, sometimes I award 5 stars to a book because I think it is genuinely a 5-star book in how it is written. Whether or not I truly enjoyed it, I feel some books deserve 5 stars. But I often also award 5 stars on emotional pull. And that is why I gave this book 5 stars. Are there flaws? Yes. Are there things that don't make sense? Yes. Are there parts of the book that feel rushed? Are there parts of the book that feel slow? Both, yes. But in terms of emotional impact, in terms of my enjoyment when reading this book, there's no parallel. This is the book that I think I enjoyed the most this year and that I enjoyed the reading process of the most. It is so genuinely moving in places, and it's really interesting how she constructed this novel, because the Lady of Shalott can see the future, and so it is written in 3 different tenses. The past, when she's talking about past events, the present for what is currently happening, and then the future for visions that she has. And there is a vision that she has in this book that is genuinely one of my favorite moments that I have ever read in fiction, and I think encapsulates a lot of what I love about Arthurian legend retellings, a lot of what I love about Dark Age Britain as a setting. I have a very complex relationship with the Arthurian legend. I really, really love it, but I often feel as though I am let down by retellings because I think I expect something from them that they can't possibly give me. One retelling can't do it all. This one does. This is probably my favorite Arthurian legend retelling of all time. And so this one is another that is a strong contender for my actual favorite of the year. I just really enjoyed this, and I expected to love it, but I didn't expect it to hit me quite so hard. Another fantasy, and the only sequel on my list this year actually, is Flamefall, which is the second in the Fireborn series, and this book, if possible, actually improved on the first. I think it's very, very hard for the second book in a trilogy to be good. It often feels as though the second book in a trilogy is really just bridging the gap between the beginning and the finale. This book did a lot of needed work, and I think when the series wraps up next year, I think I am going to look back on this as the strongest book in the series. And I don't feel as though the last book is going to make me feel like this one was treading water. Even if it was, I don't care. I love this world and I love these characters. This is a world that is set up similar to, I'm gonna say ancient Rome, because there's quite a bit in this book that is really Aeneid-like. They read a text in this series that is essentially the Aeneid of their world. But there are also shades to this world of kind of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, because one of our main characters is the survivor of the massacred imperial family from the Revolution a few years ago. So there is sort of an Anastasia-like quality to it, but there is also kind of a French Revolution type politicking going on, figuring out this new world post-revolution. And I don't want anyone to look down on it for being YA, because this book is dealing with extremely complex issues and is doing them better than a lot of adult fantasy out there today. I really, in the end, I've come to the conclusion this year that in the end, I truly do prefer YA fantasy to adult fantasy, because I think in many ways it is doing incredibly important work in terms of representation and dealing with themes, and dealing with themes blatantly. This series is very, very gray. It's interesting how you have come to love these characters and you know you will support them no matter what decision they make, but you also know they are between a rock and a hard place, and thus there are no real good options. Every option is bad. And so this is just a really complex series where you go back and forth on how you feel about people. I said in my review of this book on Goodreads that this book reminds me why I read. And it is so true. Most books you read are run-of-the-mill and you read them to pass the time. This book truly makes you stay up until 1 o'clock in the morning reading it. You get really emotionally invested. You cry, you laugh. You're really in a hole after you finish this. This is just rare for me nowadays. I remember being younger and books taking me by storm the way that this one does. And it's so much rarer for me now as an adult. And so it's just really nice to see that books are still coming out that can make you feel like a kid again. This one is definitely one of those. The themes at play here are so complex and interesting, and there's so much in terms of how it's interacting with ancient culture. I mean, it's a book about dragons. It's a book about dragon riders, but it has so much to say about current society and history. It's just a really complex series, and I highly, highly recommend it. Another of my favorites of the year was The Idiot by Dostoevsky. This was my first Dostoevsky, and I have the sense that it's going to remain my favorite. This book focuses on a character who is a really, really good person, and he is surrounded by a lot of really conniving and cruel people, and it's just interesting to see how he keeps his goodness throughout the book, and the issue that he faces by trying to be good and being really good and gentle versus being really worldly like the other characters are. This is another very complicated and complex story that I don't think you feel the weight of until towards the very end. And you've just been going along, reading for the plot, reading for the characters and enjoying it. And then you reach the end and you realize the book had quite a bit to say. And it had quite a bit that you want to take away from it as a moral of the story. It's really lushly written and the characterization is just incredible. Certain moments from this I still think about. I read this back in the summer and I still think about certain character moments here. This was just a really unique one. I knew I would probably like Dostoevsky, but I thought this one would probably be in the middle somewhere. It would be pretty run-of-the-mill. But right now, I think The Idiot is probably going to be a hard one to beat for me. Even if I love the rest of Dostoevsky's works, I think this will remain my kind of sentimental favorite for a lot of different reasons. But Prince Myshkin is my favorite character of the year. He is the main character of The Idiot. He's so good and kind, and people critique him for that. People think that he's stupid for that, but he always keeps a smile on and he keeps being himself no matter what. And I think there's something really powerful in that message. Next up is a new favorite author of the year that I read 2 books by, and I'm really torn on this. I mean, really torn on this. I didn't know which one to put on this list because I loved them both so much. In my heart, they're both on this list, but I had to choose one, and I think I'm gonna choose the one with more mass appeal because upon reflection, they both just tie for me. I thought I preferred this one, but they're both really, really wonderful books. But I think this has more mass appeal, and so it's a favorite of the year because I think I could really recommend it to people, and that is A Brightness Long Ago by Guy Gavriel Kay. Guy Gavriel Kay does something that I knew would really work well for me. He often sets his fantasy books in kind of a pseudo-Europe that is not really our Europe. Names have changed and everything, but essentially we are really reading historical fiction, but it is set in a fantasy world. He is often using real historical figures in his stories. I find it fascinating to see how he interweaves fictional elements with characters that you know are mirroring actual historical figures. He's just a very, very smart writer to me, and his books are also incredibly beautifully written. Now, this is the one that I chose. He has a book that is set in kind of a Viking Britain with a character who is essentially Alfred the Great. And in my heart of hearts, that's also on this list. But this is the one that I think I have thought about more. This is set sort of in the Italian Renaissance of this world, and it is focusing on two condottieri, which were mercenaries in the Renaissance period. And he has based these on real historical figures that really feuded, real condottieri. And so this is just, I mean, really amazing because it's really action-packed. There is a chapter in here that is essentially the Palio race from Siena that they run every year in Siena. It's a horse race. And it is genuinely the most thrilling chapter that I've read in a long time. My heart rate was up. I was pumped. I felt like I was there watching the race. It was just a really exciting read at the same time as being just so beautifully, beautifully written. His Viking book is far more melancholy in tone, and I don't think that will work very well for people. There are definitely melancholy notes here, but The Last Light of the Sun, which was his Viking book, was genuinely sad in places, and that works really well for me as a reader, actually. And I think it works specifically well for the Viking Age in Britain with certain characters and certain figures. That book was incredible. I wish I had brought it down here because I have a lot to say. But this is the one that I do think I could recommend to the most people. I think a lot of people would like this, whether you are a fantasy reader or not. If you're someone who really loves historical fiction, I think you could step into this fantasy world very, very easily. And if you just love beautiful writing, I cannot encourage you enough to pick this book up. This is just a really, really stunning fantasy. So not only is this book one of my favorites of the year, I think it is a book that I would recommend the most. Out of every book on this list, this is the book that I would recommend most people pick up. Last but not least is a book that has become one of my all-time favorites, and that is The Marble Faun by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I cannot speak highly enough about this book. This is one that I think is not going to be for everybody. Akin to Moby Dick, this one is going to be a struggle for most people, so it is not actually a book that I really recommend, but it is a book that really worked well for me personally. Akin to In the Woods, this book combined essentially every element that I love in books into one, and thus akin to In the Woods, I would tell you that this is a perfect book, but I know that it is a perfect book for me and not for everyone else. This is a 19th century classic that is set in Rome, and really the plot of this is secondary. The plot is really good, the characterization is really incredible, but Nathaniel Hawthorne's descriptions of the city of Rome will truly haunt you. If you have ever been to Rome, I think you'll feel like you're there again. If you've never been to Rome, read this book if you want to go, because I think he really takes you there. I am not someone who really reads for description. In fact, prior to BookTube, description is something that I kind of let my eyes glaze over, and I kind of skimmed to get on with the dialogue and what I thought was really important. Because I don't really think most authors have a true grip of atmosphere or setting. I think that's a gift that some authors have and others don't. It is a gift that Nathaniel Hawthorne has. He completely transports you there, and you find yourself wanting to skim the dialogue and the character moments to get back to his descriptions of the city. It is insane how beautifully written this book is, because not only is it beautiful in terms of how the city is described, but there's also, of course, a lot at play in terms of art. And I just think this book did everything beautifully. It constantly compared characters to certain art pieces, and thus that's how they were always described. One character was introduced as kind of looking like a ghost, and thus every time after that this character was spoken of or mentioned, he was described as ghostly or as like a specter. It was just genuinely brilliant how he took the metaphors and he really ran with them. I think this book will come across as very purple prosy to people who don't really like lush writing. To me, I love purple prose. Recommend me all the books that you've ever read with purple prose in them. I'm also going to read you a selection from this book, and hopefully it won't be as long as the one that I read from Moby Dick. At a distance, ascending out of the central mass of edifices, they could see the top of the Antonine Column, and near it the circular roof of the Pantheon, looking heavenward with its ever-open eye. Except these two objects, almost everything that they beheld was medieval, though built indeed of the massive old stones and indestructible bricks of imperial Rome. For the ruin of the Colosseum, the Golden House, and innumerable temples of Roman gods and mansions of Caesars and senators had supplied the material for these gigantic hovels, and their walls were cemented with mortar of inestimable cost, being made of precious antique statues burnt long ago for this petty purpose. Rome, as it now exists, has grown up under the popes, and seems like nothing but a heap of broken rubbish thrown into the great chasm between our own days and the empire, merely to fill it up. And for the better part of 2,000 years, its annals of obscure policies and wars and continually recurring misfortunes seem also but broken rubbish, as compared with its classical history. If we consider the present city as at all connected with the famous one of old, it is only because we find it built over its grave. A depth of 30 feet of soil has covered up the Rome of ancient days, so that it lies like the dead corpse of a giant, decaying for centuries with no survivor mighty enough even to bury it, until the dust of all those years has gathered slowly over its recumbent form and made a casual sepulchre. We know not how to characterize in any accordant and compatible terms the Rome that lies before us, its sunless alleys and streets of palaces, its churches lined with the gorgeous marbles that were originally polished for the adornment of pagan temples, its thousands of evil smells mixed up with the fragrance of rich incense diffused from as many censers, its little life deriving feeble nutriment from what has long been dead. Everywhere, some fragment of ruin suggesting the magnificence of a former epoch. Everywhere, moreover, a cross and nastiness at the foot of it. As the sum of all, there are recollections that kindle the soul, and a gloom and languor that depress it beyond any depth of melancholic sentiment that can be elsewhere known. Yet how is it possible to say an unkind or irreverential word of Rome, the city of all time and of all the world, the spot for which man's great life and deeds have done so much, and for which decay has done whatever glory and dominion could not do? At this moment, the evening sunshine is flinging its golden mantle over it, making all that we thought mean magnificent. The bells of all the churches suddenly ring out as if it were a peal of triumph, because Rome is still imperial. I think that really said it all. This is just an incredible read, and it's one that I am looking forward to rereading in the new year. So those were my favorite books of the year. I would love to know down below if you have read any of them and what your top book of the year was. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.